Good morning, everyone. This is Mr. Joe from Group 9, and today we will be discussing the outcome of factorial designs. It's a possible outcomes, which is composed of eight different outcomes, which is outcome 1 to 8, with factor A and factor B. And as you can see on the screen, you can be able to identify the main effect of factor A and factor B. And it says that for the outcome 1, factor has no effect on dependent variables when averaged over both levels of factor B. The second one, factor B has no effect on dependent variables when averaged over both levels of factor A. The effect of factor A does not depend on the level of factor B. It has no effect on both B1 and B2. So as you can see there, it has no effect basically. Second one, here on the outcome 2, factor A has an effect on dependent variables when averaged over both levels of factor B. The second one, factor V, has no effect on the dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor A. The effect of factor A does not depend on the level of factor B. Its effect is similar to both B1 and B2. It's almost the thing with factor A. Outcome number 3, you can see on the screen that the result of the graphs is parallel to them, especially on the factor A. It says here, factor A has no effect on dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor B. Number 2, general interpretation. Factor B has an effect on dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor A. And the effort of factor A does not depend on the level of factor B. It has no effect at both B1 and B2. Let's go to outcome number 3. Factor A has an effect to dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor B. The second one is factor B has an effect on dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor A. And number 3, the effect of factor A does not depend on the level of factor B. B1, its effect is similar to B1 and B2. Let's move on to factor B. Outcome number 5. Factor A has an effect on the dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor B. And the second interpretation, factor B has an effect on dependent variable when averaged over levels of factor B. So it's always similar that whenever the dependent variable reach the average over both levels of factor, there's always an effect on the dependent variables. In the third interpretation, the effect of factor A depends on the level of factor B. It's so much dependent on the factor A. Outcome number 6. If factor A has an effect of dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor B, and factor B has no effect on dependent variable when averaged over both levels of factor A. As you can see there, the dashed blue line, it's the one that shows the effect of being a dependent variable on both sides. The effect of factor A depends on the level of factor B. Its effect is different for B1 and B2. 7, outcome 7, the interpretation says factor A has no effect on the dependent variable. So here in outcome 7, basically factor A has no effect at all. So when averaged over both levels of factor B has an effect on the dependent variable when averaged over both levels. Similar interpretation. The effect of factor A depends on level of factor B. Its effect is different at B1 and B2. In the last outcome, factor A has an effect on dependent variables when averaged over both levels of factor B. Second interpretation, factor B has no effect on the dependent variable. Here, with the previous outcome, you can see that there is an effect. But here, you can see there's always no effect to the dependent variables. With the previously, they are much dependent. The previous outcomes, they are much dependent on the dependent variable. But here, there is no effect. And the last interpretation, the effect of factor A depends on the level of factor B. Its effect is different B1 than B2. And before we end, we will be discussing this graph depicting no interaction effects. So from the graph AB to D, you can be able to parallelize as depicted in graphs, suggest that there is no interaction effect between two factors, which is the factor A and factor B. And it says here interaction hypothesis, which is to examine the complex relationship between the factors when they should have a clearly defined interaction hypothesis. On a basic level, your alternative hypothesis for the interaction 1/2 is simply that the relationship between a factor and a dependent variable's outcome is impacted by a second factor, which mainly referred to as the moderator. The second hypothesis, which is composed of three different factors. There are three basic patterns of interactions effect that you might hypothesize for 2/2 design. First, second factor, moderator, strengthens or weakens the relationship between the first factor and the outcome. So this is the function of second factor. Number 2, which is the moderator, the relation between the first factor and outcome, which is the dependent variable, is only present at one level of the moderator. Wow. And the last one, the moderating variable changes the direction of the relationship between the first factor and the outcome of dependent variables. So the second here, which is the moderator, the function is strengthens relationship between the first factor and the outcome. As you can see on the picture here. In the second one, the relationship between the first and the outcome, it says here, is only present at one level of the moderator. And the last one, the moderating variable changes the direction of the relationship between the first factor and the outcome, which is the dependent variable. Hope with the simple report that we have in regards with 2/2 factorial design can help you out on how to work out on our skills with our subject. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay po tayong lahat. Magandang umaga po.